The billionaire's hands trembled as he stared at the woman he loved, her face pale with fear, tears streaming down her cheeks. "They're going to take everything from us," she whispered. Outside his penthouse, camera flashes erupted like lightning strikes as reporters swarmed the building. His 6-year-old daughter clung to her leg, terrified. "Tell me the truth," he said, his voice breaking. "All of it. What Keisha told him next would either destroy them or prove that some loves are worth fighting for. But to understand how they got here, we need to go back to the beginning, to the moment a broken man, a silent child, and a woman with secrets collided in a penthouse 40 stories above Manhattan. Colton Ashford was American royalty in every sense that mattered in Manhattan. Billionaire by 35, devastatingly handsome with sharp blue eyes that had stared down boardrooms and broken corporate empires. His penthouse overlooked Central Park, a glass and steel fortress 40 stories above the mess of ordinary life. He controlled everything, his companies, his image, his emotions, everything except the one thing that mattered most, his 6-year-old daughter, Zoe. The accident had happened 18 months ago. A moment of distraction, a wet road, screeching tires, and Colton's wife, Victoria, was gone. Zoe survived with a traumatic brain injury that left her unable to speak, trapped in selective mutism that no amount of money could cure. The specialists called it psychological trauma. Colton called it his failure. He'd hired the best nannies, the most acclaimed therapists, filled the penthouse with every educational toy and therapeutic tool money could buy. Zoe remained silent, her big brown eyes watching the world with an understanding that broke something inside him every single day. When the previous nanny quit, citing the emotional toll, Colton's assistant hired a replacement without bothering him with details. He was in Tokyo closing a deal when Keisha Morris walked through his door for the first time. She wasn't what he expected. Beautiful, yes, with rich dark skin that glowed like warm honey, natural curls pulled back simply, and an understated elegance that had nothing to do with designer labels. But it was her eyes that would haunt him later, deep brown and impossibly kind, holding a wisdom that seemed too heavy for someone so young. She carried herself with quiet dignity, neither intimidated by the wealth surrounding her nor impressed by it. During the brief video interview from his hotel, Colton had barely looked up from his laptop. She'd answered his questions about experience and availability in a soft, melodic voice. Then she'd asked her own question, one that made him pause. Does Zoe like to be held, or does she prefer her space? No one had asked that before. They'd asked about schedules, about pay, about his expectations. Never about what Zoe needed emotionally. Colton returned from Tokyo 3 days later to a penthouse that felt different. Not visibly. The immaculate modern furnishings remained untouched, but something in the air had shifted. He found Keisha in the kitchen, humming something low and soulful while preparing dinner, and Zoe sitting at the counter, not playing on her tablet as usual, but watching Keisha with rare focus. "Mr. Ashford?" Keisha greeted him with a slight nod, professional but warm. "Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. Zoe's had her therapy session and her homework is complete." Colton nodded, loosening his tie, about to retreat to his study as he always did. But something stopped him. Zoe hadn't looked away from Keisha, and there was something in his daughter's expression he hadn't seen in over a year. Interest, engagement, life. That night, unable to sleep, Colton did something he'd avoided for months. He opened the security camera application on his phone. He told himself it was routine, just checking that everything was secure. But his finger hovered over the living room feed from earlier that evening, and he pressed play. What he saw made his breath catch. The footage showed Keisha sitting cross-legged on the floor, Zoe mirroring her position a few feet away. Between them sat a large bowl of water and several small objects, a feather, a smooth stone, a piece of silk. Keisha wasn't speaking, wasn't forcing interaction. She simply picked up each item, dipped it in the water, and observed it with complete attention. After several minutes, Zoe's small hand reached forward, hesitant, and touched the feather. Keisha smiled, not with triumph or excitement that might startle the moment, but with simple acknowledgement. Then Keisha did something extraordinary. She began to hum, low and gentle, a melody that seemed to come from somewhere deep and ancient. Zoe's shoulders, always rigid with tension, began to soften. The little girl picked up the stone, submerged it, watched the water ripple. Keisha hummed a different note, matching the rhythm of the ripples. Understanding dawned in Zoe's eyes, and she created another ripple, faster. Keisha's humming changed again, following her lead. They were communicating without words, without pressure, without the clinical detachment of therapy. Just two souls finding a language between them. Colton felt something crack in his chest. Over the next week, he found himself watching more footage, staying late at the office not for work, but to review the day's recordings. He saw Keisha reading to Zoe, not children's books, but poetry, letting the rhythm and emotion of the words wash over the silent child. He saw her dancing in the kitchen, encouraging Zoe to feel the music through vibrations in the floor. He saw her sitting beside Zoe during nightmare episodes, not trying to fix or soothe, but simply being present, a steady heartbeat in the darkness. But it was the moments Keisha didn't know anyone would see that undid him completely. Late one evening, the bedroom camera captured Zoe having a meltdown, throwing pillows, tears streaming down her face in frustrated silence. Colton reached for his phone to intervene, but Keisha was already there. She didn't try to stop the tantrum or calm Zoe down. Instead, she grabbed pillows of her own and threw them, matching Zoe's energy, validating her rage. When Zoe finally collapsed, exhausted, Keisha sat beside her and spoke in a voice thick with emotion. "You're allowed to be angry, baby girl. You're allowed to miss your mama. You're allowed to hate that the words won't come. I'm angry too. Life isn't fair, and pretending it is won't help you. But I promise you this." She gathered Zoe into her arms, and the child didn't pull away. "Your voice is still in there. Different doesn't mean gone, and until you find it again, I'll listen to everything you can't say." Zoe curled into Keisha's embrace, and for the first time since Victoria's death, Colton watched his daughter truly let someone in. He closed his laptop, hands shaking, tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed finally falling. All this time he'd tried to fix Zoe with money, with the best professionals, with control. But healing wasn't a transaction. It was trust, presence, and a love that asked for nothing in return. The next morning, Colton came home early. He found Keisha in the sunroom teaching Zoe to plant herbs in small pots, their hands dirty with soil, soft laughter in the air. When Keisha noticed him standing in the doorway, she straightened, suddenly professional again. "Mr. Ashford, I wasn't expecting you until—" "Colton," he interrupted quietly. "Please, call me Colton." Something shifted in the air between them. Keisha tilted her head, studying him with those knowing eyes, and he realized she'd sensed his walls beginning to crumble. "Colton," she repeated softly, and the sound of his name in her voice felt like absolution. Over the following weeks, Colton found excuses to come home earlier, to linger over morning coffee, to ask Keisha's opinion on matters that had nothing to do with Zoe's care. She met his attempts at connection with gentle warmth, never overstepping, but never retreating either. They began having dinner together after Zoe went to bed, conversations that started with his daughter and deepened into something more, stories of Keisha's childhood in Atlanta, her grandmother who raised her, the social work degree she'd put on hold to help pay medical bills. She spoke of dreams deferred but not abandoned, and Colton found himself sharing truths he'd never voiced. The guilt he carried about Victoria's death, the fear that he was failing Zoe, the loneliness of having everything and feeling nothing. "You're not failing her," Keisha said one night, her hand briefly covering his across the table. "You're learning. That's all any of us can do." But when he tried to hold her hand longer, she gently pulled away, her eyes clouding with something he couldn't quite read. "Some of us have more to learn from than others," she whispered, so softly he almost didn't hear it. The touch lingered in his mind for days, but so did the shadow that had crossed her face. One evening, Colton worked up the courage to confess about the cameras. They sat on the terrace under string lights, the city glittering below them, and he told her everything. How he'd watched, how he'd seen her with Zoe, how she'd given his daughter something all his money couldn't buy. Keisha was quiet for a long moment, her fingers twisting together in her lap. Then she smiled, sad and knowing. "I wondered when you'd tell me. I saw the cameras the first day." "You knew?" Colton's voice cracked with shame. "And you still—" "I stayed because of Zoe," Keisha said simply. "And because I understood. You were trying to protect her the only way you knew how." She paused, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. We all do things we're ashamed of when we're trying to protect the people we love. Something in her tone made him look at her sharply, but her face was turned away, lost in the city lights. Keisha, but Colton? She turned to face him fully, and he saw something raw and vulnerable in her eyes. You can't heal her from behind a screen. You have to be in the mess with her, with us. I don't know how, he admitted, and it was the most honest thing he'd said in years. Then let me show you, Keisha whispered, but even as she said it, her hand trembled slightly in his. From that night on, everything changed. Colton began joining their evening rituals, sitting on the floor with them, learning the wordless language Keisha and Zoe had created. He learned to listen not just with his ears but with his heart, to read Zoe's expressions, her gestures, the way her silence spoke volumes. And slowly, impossibly, he learned to be present. Not the distant father behind closed doors, but a man willing to be vulnerable, to fail, to try again. Keisha taught him more than how to connect with Zoe. She taught him how to live again, how to find joy in small moments, how to laugh at his own rigidity, how to let someone see him not as the invincible billionaire, but as a man who was broken and trying to heal. And somewhere in the laughter and the tears, in the quiet mornings and the chaotic bedtimes, in the way Keisha's eyes softened when she looked at him, and the way his heart raced when she smiled, they fell in love. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind, but the real kind, built on shared purpose and mutual respect, on seeing each other's flaws and choosing each other anyway. The moment Colton knew he loved her came 3 months after she'd arrived. Zoe had drawn a picture, her small hand carefully coloring 3 figures holding hands. When Colton asked who they were, Zoe pointed to each one. The first, herself. The second, Keisha. The third, him. Then Zoe did something that stopped time. She looked at Keisha, then at Colton, and in a voice rusty from disuse but achingly clear, she whispered one word. Family. Her first word in 18 months, Keisha burst into tears, pulling Zoe into her arms. Colton dropped to his knees beside them, his own tears falling freely, and wrapped his arms around both of them. In that moment, everything he thought he knew about love, about family, about what mattered shattered and reformed into something truer. Later that night, after Zoe had fallen asleep between them during a celebration movie, Colton carried his daughter to bed. When he returned, Keisha was standing by the window, looking out at the city lights. Her arms wrapped around herself as if she were cold despite the warm evening. Keisha, he said softly. She turned, and there was something almost fearful in her eyes, like she knew what was coming and dreaded it. He closed the distance between them, his hands gently framing her face. I love you, he said, the words feeling both terrifying and inevitable. I don't know when it happened or how to deserve you, but I love you. You gave me back my daughter, but more than that, you gave me back myself. You saw through all my walls and loved what you found anyway. I'm asking. His voice broke. I'm begging you to stay, not as an employee, but as... Colton, stop. Her voice cracked and tears spilled down her cheeks. She pulled back slightly, shaking her head. You don't know what you're saying. You don't know who I really am. I know everything I need to know. No. The word came out sharp, almost desperate. You know who I am now. But people aren't just who they are in the present. We're also who we were, and Her voice broke completely. I'm not worthy of this. Of you, of what you're offering. Keisha, you're a good man, Colton Ashford. The best man I've ever known, and Zoe deserves everything beautiful in this world. She wiped at her tears with shaking hands. But I've done things that would make you look at me differently. Things that would make you question whether I should be anywhere near your daughter. His heart pounded with confusion and growing fear. Then tell me. Whatever it is, we'll face it together. She looked at him with such anguish that it physically hurt him. I want to. God, I want to. But I'm terrified that when you know the truth, you'll look at me the way the rest of the world did. Like I'm someone to be ashamed of. That's impossible, he said fiercely, pulling her close even as she tried to resist. There's nothing you could tell me that would make me stop loving you. She let out a broken laugh through her tears. Don't make promises you can't keep. Try me. For a long moment, she stood there in his arms, trembling. He could feel her internal battle, the words fighting to break free and the fear holding them back. Finally, she pulled back and looked up at him with red, swollen eyes. "I need time," she whispered. "Please, I will tell you everything, I promise. I need to find the courage first." He wanted to push, to demand answers, but something in her desperation stopped him. "How much time?" "Soon," she said, and there was a finality in her voice that suggested both a promise and a farewell. Before things go any further. You deserve to make an informed choice about who you're letting into your life." Then before he could respond, she kissed him, but it wasn't the soft, sure kiss he'd expected. It was desperate, almost grief-stricken, like she was trying to memorize the feeling before it was taken away forever. When she pulled back, she whispered against his lips, "I've been in love with you for weeks. I was just waiting for you to catch up, but now I'm terrified I've waited too long." "What does that mean?" "It means I love you too much to start this with lies." She stepped out of his embrace, wrapping her arms around herself again. "Give me a few days. Please, to find the right words, to be brave enough to give you the truth." He wanted to argue, to tell her that nothing from her past could matter, but the fear in her eyes stopped him. Whatever secret she carried, it was heavy enough to make her doubt the very love she'd just confessed. "A few days," he agreed reluctantly. "But Keisha, nothing you tell me will change how I feel." She gave him a sad smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You can't know that yet." She left him standing there on the terrace, and for the first time since she'd entered his life, Colton felt the cold creep back in. The next few days were torture. Keisha continued caring for Zoe with the same devotion, but there was a weight to her now, a sadness that hung over her like a storm cloud. Colton caught her staring at him sometimes with such longing and regret that it made his chest ache. She'd open her mouth as if to speak, then close it again, the words dying before they could be born. One morning, he found her in Zoe's room, watching the little girl sleep. Tears were streaming silently down her face. "Keisha?" she startled, quickly wiping her eyes. "I'm sorry, I was just—" Her voice broke. "She's so perfect. You're both so perfect, and I should not ruin everything. You could never—" "You don't know that." She looked at him with desperate eyes. "What if I'm the one thing that damages her? What if my past, what if it hurts you both?" "What past? Talk to me, please." She shook her head, more tears falling. "Tonight, I promise, I'll tell you tonight after dinner, and then you can decide if you still want me here." That evening felt endless. Keisha was quiet during dinner, barely eating. Afterwards, Keisha took his hand. "The terrace?" she asked quietly. He nodded, his heart hammering with dread and curiosity. They sat across from each other under the string lights, the city alive below them, and Keisha took a deep, shaking breath. Her hands trembled as she folded them in her lap. "Before I tell you," she said, her voice barely audible, "I need you to know that everything I've given you and Zoe has been real. My love, my care, my commitment, none of that was a lie. Whatever you think of me after tonight, please believe that." I do." He reached for her hand, but she pulled back. Colton felt fear grip his heart. What could possibly be so terrible? Keisha looked up at the stars, gathering courage, and began. 7 years ago, His phone rang. Loud, insistent. His head of security. "Ignore it," Keisha said quickly, almost panicked. "Please, Colton, I need to do this now before I lose my nerve." But the phone rang again. And again. Colton looked at the screen, saw the urgent flash, and his blood ran cold. "I'm sorry, something's wrong. I have to—" Keisha's face went pale as he answered. She knew somehow that the moment had passed, that the truth wouldn't come from her lips willingly, but would be ripped from the shadows whether she was ready or not. And as Colton listened to his head of security's urgent voice, watched Keisha's face crumble with devastation, he realized that whatever she'd been trying to tell him, the world was about to tell him first. "Sir, we have a situation. You need to see the news, now." The voice tight with urgency at the other end of the phone. Colton rushed in and turned on the television to see Keisha's face plastered across every channel. The headlines made his blood run cold. Billionaire's girlfriend, criminal past exposed. Con artist targets Ashford fortune. From prison to penthouse. The real Keisha Morris. He stood frozen as reporters detailed it all. 7 years ago, Keisha had been convicted of identity theft and fraud. She'd stolen from the family she worked for as a caregiver, desperate to pay for her grandmother's cancer treatment. She'd served 3 years in prison. The charges, the mugshot, the court records. It was all there, laid bare for the world to judge. His phone exploded with calls. His board of directors, his lawyers, his family. Everyone with the same message. Get rid of her before she destroys everything you've built. After what seemed like eternity, Colton found Keisha in Zoe's room, holding the sleeping child, tears streaming silently down her face. She looked up at him with such devastation that it shattered something inside him. "I was going to tell you," she whispered. "I've been trying to find the courage every single day. I never meant to deceive you, Colton. I wanted to be someone new, someone worthy of you and Zoe. But my past found me anyway." She carefully laid Zoe down and stood, her dignity intact even as her world crumbled. "I'll leave tonight. I won't let this touch you or Zoe. I love you both too much for that." This was the moment every person in Colton's life was watching for. Would the billionaire choose his pristine reputation or the woman who'd given him back his heart? Colton crossed the room and took her hands in his. "Tell me everything, from the beginning. No more secrets." Through her tears, Keisha told him, her grandmother, the only parent she'd ever known, dying of cancer with no insurance. The desperation that made a good woman make a terrible choice. The family she'd worked for, who'd flaunted their wealth while refusing her plea for a small loan to save a life. How she'd stolen their credit card information, used it for one hospital payment, and been caught immediately. The trial, where remorse couldn't undo her crime. Prison, where she'd earned her GED, started college courses, and promised herself she'd never let desperation make her cruel again. "I served my time," she said, her voice breaking. "I've been rebuilding ever since. Every day for 7 years, I've tried to be better than that desperate girl who made the worst choice of her life. But it doesn't matter, does it? Because that's all anyone will ever see when they look at me." She met his eyes and the pain in them was unbearable. "That's all you'll see now. The woman who lied to you, who came into your home with secrets, who put your daughter at risk by association with a criminal." "Stop," Colton said, but his voice was shaking and he couldn't tell if it was from anger or something else entirely. "I'll understand if you can't, if you won't." She could barely get the words out. "This is why I tried to tell you. This is why I said you didn't know who I really was. Because I knew this would change everything." She carefully laid Zoe down and stood, her dignity intact even as her world crumbled. "I'll leave tonight. I won't let this touch you or Zoe. I love you both too much for that." "Stop," Colton said firmly. He cupped her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Do you remember what you told me when I confessed about the cameras? You said I couldn't heal Zoe from behind a screen. That I had to be in the mess with her." Keisha nodded, confused. "You taught me that love means standing in the mess together. So that's what I'm doing. I'm standing with you." His voice grew fierce. "You made a mistake born of love and desperation. You paid for it, you rebuilt yourself. That's not a scandal, Keisha. That's courage. And if the world can't see that, then they can answer to me. But your reputation, your business, means nothing without you." He pulled her close, his own tears finally falling. "You gave me back my daughter. You gave me back my life. You think I'm going to let tabloids and board members take you from me? From us?" He gestured to Zoe, who'd woken up and was watching them with wide, understanding eyes. "Don't go, Keisha," she said clearly. "You're our family." Colton spent a sleepless night doing what he did best, hunting for answers. His head of security traced the leak to Ben Hart, a former business rival who'd lost a major deal to Colton 6 months earlier and had been waiting for revenge. Ben had hired a private investigator who'd been surveilling the penthouse for weeks, capturing telephoto shots of intimate moments through the windows. Colton and Keisha on the terrace, their body language betraying feelings neither had voiced yet, the way he looked at her when she wasn't watching, the way she touched his hand across the dinner table. The investigator had run a background check on every person in Colton's orbit and struck gold with Keisha's sealed records, which he'd illegally accessed through a corrupt court clerk. By dawn, Colton's lawyers had filed lawsuits against Ben, the investigator, and the clerk for invasion of privacy, illegal surveillance, and unlawful access to sealed records. He'd also secured injunctions preventing further publication of the surveillance photos. But Colton told none of this to Keisha. She had enough to carry without knowing she'd been watched, photographed, turned into ammunition in someone else's vendetta. He would handle this part alone, the way he'd always handled threats to the people he loved, swiftly, decisively, and without mercy. By the next morning, Ben Hart's reputation was in ruins, his assets frozen, and criminal charges pending. Justice, Colton had learned from Keisha, wasn't just about punishment. It was about protection. The next morning, Colton called a press conference. With Keisha by his side, her hand firmly in his, he faced a room full of reporters and cameras. He didn't deny her past. He didn't make excuses. He simply told the truth. 7 years ago, the woman I love made a desperate choice to save the person who raised her. She broke the law and she paid her debt to society. She could have let that mistake define her. Instead, she spent every day since becoming someone who gives more than she takes, who heals instead of hurts. She saved my daughter when I couldn't. She saved me when I didn't know I needed saving. Her past doesn't scare me. It proves she's strong enough to stand beside me through anything. He turned to look at Keisha, his eyes blazing with love and defiance. So to anyone who thinks they can use her past to tear us apart, let me be crystal clear. You'll fail. Because I'm not marrying her despite who she was. I'm marrying her because of who she became. And if that costs me business partners or social standing, good. I don't want to associate with people who've never made mistakes or needed second chances. The room erupted in questions, but Colton simply took Keisha's hand and walked out, Zoe between them, a family united. The fallout was intense but temporary. Some business partners distanced themselves. The tabloids had a field day, but others, surprisingly more than Colton expected, reached out with support. People who'd made their own mistakes, who believed in redemption, who saw the love story beneath the scandal. And through it all, Colton never wavered. When Keisha had nightmares about losing them, he held her. When protesters gathered outside the building, he hired extra security and kept their lives as normal as possible. When she offered again to leave, to spare them the pain, he simply said, "We're in this mess together, remember? That was your rule." 6 months later, they were married in a small ceremony in the penthouse garden. Fewer guests than would normally attend, but the ones who came were the ones who mattered. Zoe served as flower girl, beaming with pride. As Colton watched Keisha walk toward him, radiant despite everything they'd endured, he thought about the journey that brought them here. He'd installed cameras to protect Zoe from danger, but they'd recorded something else entirely. The moment love walked through his door. The moment a woman with a painful past and a beautiful heart taught him that everyone deserves grace, including himself. As they exchanged vows, Keisha whispered something meant only for him. "Thank you for standing in the mess with me. Always," he promised. "That's what love is." And somewhere in that moment, with Zoe laughing and crying at the same time, with the few chosen witnesses dabbing their eyes, with the city glittering below them and their future uncertain but together, Colton understood the truth Keisha had been teaching him all along. Love isn't about perfection. It's not about pristine reputations or unblemished pasts. It's about choosing someone, scars and all, and saying, "I see all of you and I'm not going anywhere." Because in the end, the greatest wealth isn't measured in bank accounts or social standing. It's measured in the people who stand beside you when everything falls apart. It's measured in second chances, in radical grace, in the courage to love someone completely. And that, Colton realized as he kissed his wife for the first time, was a fortune no scandal could ever touch. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that true love means standing together through the storms, that everyone deserves a second chance, and that the most beautiful love stories are written by imperfect people choosing each other anyway, subscribe to the channel. Because stories like these remind us that redemption is real, that love is stronger than judgment, and that the greatest riches in life can't be bought. They can only be given freely, received gratefully, and protected fiercely.